The galactic hegemony's premier military academy operated on a simple principle: if you could survive graduation, you might just survive your first real deployment. Of course, survival was a relative term when your curriculum included courses like advanced void combat and diplomatic relations with species that consider you lunch. The Academy's founders, in their infinite wisdom, had decided that the best way to prepare young beings for the harsh realities of interstellar conflict was to throw them into controlled versions of said harsh realities and see who emerged with all their limbs still attached. The testing protocols were legendary throughout the galaxy, whispered about in hushed tones at diplomatic dinners and military conferences. Each species had their own traditional final examination, usually involving their homeworld's most dangerous predator, in what administrators cheerfully called stress evaluation scenarios. The Krillians faced their crystal spiders in zero gravity. The Thexmari endured combat trials against their infamous shadow hunters. The Volanti cadets were locked in chambers with swarms of their homeworld's acid wasps, because apparently the Volanti believed character was built through systematic torture. It was all very civilized, very organized, and very deadly. The Academy maintained a modest mortality rate of only 12%, which was considered quite reasonable by galactic standards. After all, space was dangerous, and dead heroes were cheaper than live cowards when it came to military budgets. The Human Exchange Program had been established as part of a broader diplomatic initiative, though most faculty members viewed it as elaborate entertainment. Humans were a curiosity, a species so new to interstellar politics that their homeworld still had active tectonic plates and weather patterns that changed seasonally. They were considered harmless enough, physically unremarkable, and possessed of an amusing tendency to form emotional attachments to small, furry creatures that served no apparent practical purpose. The Academy's xenobiology department had classified humans as persistent omnivores with anxiety disorders, which seemed accurate enough based on their preliminary studies. They were neither particularly strong nor particularly fast, showed concerning levels of attachment to concepts like fairness and personal space, and had the peculiar habit of consuming liquid stimulants to achieve basic cognitive function in the morning hours. Admiral Vexthara, the Academy's commandant, viewed the Human Exchange Program with the sort of bemused tolerance one might reserve for a child's pet project. Her crystalline physiology allowed her to process multiple data streams simultaneously, which came in handy when dealing with the various bureaucratic nightmares that seemed to follow human students around like faithful pets. She'd overseen the graduation of 17 different species during her tenure, and while each had their unique challenges, none had generated quite as much paperwork as the humans. Dr. Corthavel, the Academy's senior xenobiology specialist, maintained detailed files on every cadet's physiological specifications, combat capabilities, and psychological profiles. His insectoid nature made him naturally methodical, and he approached the study of alien species with the same enthusiasm others might reserve for collecting rare minerals or composing poetry. The human files were thin, embarrassingly thin. Most of their data came from self-reported surveys and medical examinations, which had revealed a species that seemed perpetually concerned about their own mortality, while simultaneously engaging in recreational activities that actively endangered said mortality. Captain Zaraneth commanded the Academy's Combat Training Division, and her aquatic heritage made her naturally suited to fluid, adaptive combat techniques. She'd worked with cadets from species that could tear through steel with their bare claws, others that could generate electromagnetic pulses, and several that could literally explode themselves as a defensive mechanism. The human cadets, by comparison, seemed almost quaint in their limitations. The current human cadet, Marcus Chen, had arrived at the Academy 6 months earlier as part of the latest exchange rotation. He was unremarkable in the way humans tended to be unremarkable. Average height by galactic standards, bipedal locomotion, forward-facing eyes that suggested a predatory heritage their species had clearly abandoned sometime in their evolutionary past. He maintained the typical human obsession with maintaining social connections, sending regular communications back to his homeworld, and displaying holographic images of other humans in various recreational settings. What made Marcus slightly more interesting than his predecessors was his apparent competence. Not exceptional competence, mind you, just the sort of steady, reliable performance that suggested he might actually survive his final examination, rather than becoming another entry in the Academy's casualty statistics. His academic performance was solid, his combat training scores were respectable, and he'd managed to complete 6 months of intensive instruction without requiring medical intervention, psychological counseling, or diplomatic immunity. This presented the Academy administration with something of a dilemma. The academic board convened on a Tuesday, which was universally acknowledged as the most bureaucratic day of the standard galactic week. Admiral Vexthara presided over the meeting with the sort of crystalline patience that came from centuries of dealing with military politics, while Dr. Korthvel presented his comprehensive analysis of Marcus Chen's readiness for final examination. The human cadet demonstrates adequate proficiency across all required competencies, Dr. Korthen reported, his mandibles clicking in the rhythm that indicated professional satisfaction. Physical conditioning is within acceptable parameters for his species, tactical knowledge meets minimum standards, and psychological stability appears remarkably consistent despite the stress factors we've introduced into his training regimen. Captain Zaraneth shifted in her aquatic suspension chair, her gill slits fluttering with what might have been amusement. He's also remarkably difficult to rattle. Most species show pronounced stress responses when we introduce combat scenarios. The human just adapts. It's almost disappointing. Admiral Vexthara processed this information through her primary cognitive matrix while simultaneously reviewing Marcus's complete academic file. Recommendations for final examination parameters. This was where things became complicated. The Academy's protocols were clear. Each cadet faced their species' traditional apex predator in a controlled combat scenario. The examination wasn't designed to be fair, it was designed to simulate the sort of catastrophic encounter that might occur during actual military service. Cadets were expected to demonstrate tactical thinking, resource management, and survival instincts under extreme duress. The problem was that human apex predators were, frankly, embarrassing. Dr. Korthvel had compiled an extensive analysis of Earth's predatory species, and the results were almost comically inadequate by galactic standards. The largest terrestrial predators were something called bears, which were essentially oversized omnivores with anger management issues. The most efficient hunters were various species of large cats, which possessed reasonable speed and agility, but lacked any sort of exotic capabilities. The most dangerous marine predators were sharks, which were basically swimming teeth, with primitive nervous systems. None of these creatures would present a meaningful challenge to a cadet who'd completed 6 months of academy training. A properly equipped graduate could probably face down Earth's entire predatory ecosystem simultaneously and still have time for a leisurely meal afterward. We could utilize one of the standard academy predators, Captain Zaraneth suggested. The Krillian crystal spiders are appropriately challenging and they've been thoroughly tested with bipedal species. Admiral Vexthara's crystalline structure flickered with consideration. The diplomatic implications of a human cadet being killed by another species' apex predator could be complex. The Thexmari shadow hunters? Dr. Korthave offered. They're less immediately lethal, more focused on psychological intimidation. Still not ideal. We need something that provides appropriate challenge without creating interspecies incidents. The debate continued for several hours, cycling through various options from the Academy's extensive collection of carefully maintained apex predators. Each species contributed their traditional examination creature to the Academy's ecosystem, creating what was effectively a traveling nightmare zoo of the galaxy's most dangerous life forms. Finally, Captain Zaraneth proposed what seemed like the obvious solution. What about the Moorkeepers? The suggestion created a moment of thoughtful silence. Moorkeepers were the apex predators of the hegemony itself, creatures that had evolved on a world where survival required constant vigilance and overwhelming lethality. They were intelligent, adaptable, and possessed of an almost supernatural ability to assess threats and respond accordingly. More importantly, they weren't associated with any particular member species, making them diplomatically neutral. The Moorkeepers are substantial, Admiral Vexthara observed, perhaps excessive for a human cadet. Dr. Corthell consulted his files. Standard protocol allows for environmental modifications to ensure appropriate challenge levels. We could limit the engagement space, provide additional equipment options, or implement time constraints. Very well. Requisition a morekeeper from the primary facility. Inform them we'll need a specimen suitable for examination purposes. Experienced but not overly aggressive. The requisition process for apex predators involved more paperwork than most military campaigns. Forms had to be filed with the Exotic Species Management Division, the Academy Safety Committee, the Interspecies Ethics Board, and the Insurance and Liability Assessment Office. Each department had their own requirements, deadlines, and bureaucratic peculiarities that seemed designed to discourage anyone from actually borrowing dangerous creatures for educational purposes. 3 weeks later, the shipment arrived. Grimjaw had been serving as an examination predator for 8 years, which made him something of a veteran in the Academy's ecosystem. He was a mature morekeeper, measuring roughly 4 meters in length, and possessing the sort of casual lethality that came from millennia of evolutionary refinement. His species had developed on a world where everything was either predator or prey, usually both, and survival required constant assessment of threat levels and appropriate responses. Unlike most apex predators, morekeepers were genuinely intelligent, not merely cunning or instinctual, but possessed of complex reasoning capabilities and sophisticated social structures. Grimjaw understood his role in the Academy's educational system, and he took professional pride in providing appropriate challenges for graduating cadets. He'd faced members of 17 different species during his tenure, and he maintained perfect records. Every cadet had survived their encounter, most had learned valuable lessons about combat under pressure, and several had gone on to distinguished military careers. The process was usually straightforward. Academy staff would brief him on the cadet species, capabilities, and any special considerations. He would review their training records, assess their likely responses to various intimidation techniques, and design an encounter that would test their limits without causing permanent damage. It was skilled work, requiring careful calibration between genuine danger and educational value. The briefing for the human cadet followed standard protocols. Grimjaw's handler, a nervous volante named Specialist Crickstell, provided the usual technical details about human physiology, psychological profiles, and combat capabilities. The data was underwhelming. Humans were physically unremarkable by galactic standards. No natural weapons, no exotic abilities, no particularly impressive sensory capabilities. They were tool musers, which was interesting but hardly unique. They showed reasonable learning capacity and adequate problem-solving skills. Their psychology suggested they were social creatures with strong pack bonds and pronounced emotional responses to stress. What made the briefing unusual was what wasn't included. Most species had distinctive fear responses, specific phobias that could be exploited for educational purposes, or particular combat patterns that could be predicted and countered. The human files contained none of this information. Instead, they were filled with observations about adaptability, persistence, and unpredictable tactical approaches. Grimjaw found this concerning. In his experience, species that were difficult to categorize were usually difficult to categorize for good reason. Evolution didn't produce average apex predators any more than it produced average prey species. Everything had a niche, a specialty, a particular evolutionary strategy that had allowed them to survive long enough to reach the stars. The question was, what was the human specialty? The examination arena was a standard design, a circular space roughly 50 meters in diameter with variable terrain features and environmental controls. For Marcus Chen's trial, the staff had configured it to resemble a rocky mountainous environment, with multiple elevation changes and hiding spots. The lighting was set to simulate dawn conditions, providing reasonable visibility while maintaining dramatic shadows that could conceal movement. Standard safety protocols were in place, medical teams on standby, emergency extraction procedures tested and ready, and non-lethal intervention options available if the situation escalated beyond acceptable parameters. The Academy's insurance requirements were quite specific about maintaining cadets in salvageable condition. Marcus entered the arena with the sort of calm composure that had characterized his entire time at the academy. He wore standard combat gear, lightweight armor, basic survival equipment, and a selection of non-lethal weapons that could theoretically slow down a determined apex predator long enough for him to implement some sort of tactical solution. The observation deck, filled with faculty members, fellow cadets, and assorted academy staff, who'd heard rumors about the unusual nature of this particular examination. Human trials had become something of a novelty, partly because of their rarity, and partly because of their species' tendency to produce unexpected outcomes through sheer stubbornness. Admiral Vex Thara addressed the assembly through the arena's communication system. "Cadet Chen, you will face standard examination protocols. Demonstrate tactical thinking, resource management, and survival capabilities. The trial will conclude when either the time limit expires or the examining predator acknowledges your competence." Marcus nodded acknowledgement and began a methodical survey of the arena space, noting terrain features, potential shelter locations, and available resources. His movements were economical, purposeful, and completely devoid of the nervous energy that typically characterized pre-examination behavior. In the holding area beneath the arena floor, Grimjaw waited for his release signal while observing the human through strategically placed monitors. This was always the most informative part of any examination, watching how cadets prepared, what they prioritized, and how they managed their stress responses in the minutes before facing genuine danger. Most cadets exhibited predictable patterns, checking and rechecking equipment, attempting to identify optimal defensive positions, or engaging in species-specific calming rituals. Some paced nervously, others remained motionless to conserve energy, and a few engaged in elaborate psychological preparation routines. The human did none of these things. Instead, Marcus moved through the arena with a sort of systematic thoroughness that suggested he was conducting a professional assessment rather than preparing for a survival trial. He tested the stability of various rock formations, examined the sight lines between different positions, and even spent several minutes studying the arena's ceiling structure. His behavior suggested he was mapping not just the immediate environment, but potential failure points, escape routes, and tactical advantages that might not be immediately obvious. This was unusual. Most cadets focused on immediate threats and defensive preparations. This human appeared to be conducting a comprehensive battlefield analysis as if he were planning an extended campaign rather than surviving a single encounter. Grimjaw felt the first stirrings of genuine interest. Perhaps this examination would be more educational than he'd anticipated. The release signal activated, and the arena floor opened to reveal the access tunnel. Grimjaw emerged with the sort of fluid grace that 4 meters of perfectly evolved predator could manage, his movements designed to demonstrate both power and control. Most cadets experienced a moment of paralytic shock upon seeing him for the first time. The Morekeeper physique was specifically designed to trigger deep-seated predator fear responses across multiple species. Marcus Chen looked up from his examination of a rocky outcropping, made direct eye contact with Grimjaw, and nodded politely. The gesture was so unexpected, so completely contrary to appropriate prey behavior, that Grimjaw actually paused mid-stride. In the observation deck, Dr. Cortefel leaned forward in his chair. Did the human just acknowledge the predator socially? Captain Zarameth's gill slits fluttered with confusion. That's not standard fear response behavior. Admiral Vex Thara accessed multiple data streams simultaneously, trying to process what they were observing. Perhaps the human doesn't recognize the threat level. Down in the arena, Marcus had returned to his terrain analysis, while keeping Grimjaw in his peripheral vision. He wasn't ignoring the massive predator, but he wasn't treating him as an immediate threat either. Instead, he seemed to be waiting. Grimjaw found this behavior fascinating and deeply disturbing. Prey species, even intelligent ones, displayed predictable responses to apex predators: flight, fight, freeze, or submit. These were the standard options encoded into millions of years of evolutionary psychology. Tool-using species might attempt more sophisticated responses, but they still operated within recognizable parameters. This human was doing something else entirely. Grimjaw began a standard intimidation approach, moving in a wide circle around Marcus's position while displaying the sort of controlled aggression that usually triggered immediate defensive responses. His species had perfected the art of psychological warfare, using their size, speed, and obvious lethality to force prey into making tactical errors. Marcus continued his systematic examination of the arena environment. The approach wasn't working. Grimjaw escalated to more direct intimidation, closing the distance and using his full physical presence to create psychological pressure. Most cadets would have moved to defensive positions by now, drawn weapons, or at least shown some indication of elevated stress levels. Marcus glanced over, made that same polite acknowledgement gesture, and continued his work. In the observation deck, the assembled faculty were beginning to murmur among themselves. This wasn't following any recognized pattern for academy examination protocols. Some were wondering if the human was experiencing some sort of psychological breakdown, while others speculated about possible species-specific sensory limitations that might prevent him from recognizing the danger he was in. Grimjaw was beginning to reach similar conclusions, but from a different perspective. As an apex predator, he'd developed finely tuned instincts for assessing threats and prey. These instincts operated on multiple levels: physical capabilities, behavioral patterns, and more subtle indicators that were difficult to quantify but absolutely essential for survival. Every species he'd encountered during his academy service had produced recognizable signatures, stress hormones, movement patterns, and unconscious behaviors that clearly identified them as prey animals in a predatory encounter. The human wasn't producing any of these signatures. More disturbing, Marcus was producing signatures that Grimjaw's instincts recognized as something else. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The human wasn't responding like prey because the human wasn't prey. Every instinct Grimjaw possessed was suddenly screaming warnings about engaging with another apex predator in an enclosed space. His species had survived for millennia by being very, very careful about territorial disputes with other apex predators, because such encounters typically ended with at least one participant dying horribly. The human's calm, methodical behavior wasn't the response of prey preparing for survival, it was the response of a predator conducting pre-engagement reconnaissance. Grimjaw took an involuntary step backward. In the observation deck, Admiral Vexthara's crystalline structure flickered with confusion. The Moorkeeper appears to be withdrawing? Dr. Corpville was frantically reviewing his files. This is unprecedented. Moorkeepers don't retreat from examination protocols. Captain Zeramith was already reaching for the emergency communication controls. Something's wrong. We need to abort the trial. Down in the arena, Marcus had finally completed his environmental assessment and was now giving Grimjaw his full attention. The human's posture was relaxed but ready, his movements economical and purposeful. He wasn't displaying any of the aggressive behaviors that typically characterized inter-predator confrontations, but he was clearly prepared for whatever might happen next. The two apex predators regarded each other across 30 meters of artificial terrain, each recognizing something in the other that the Academy's sophisticated instruments had completely failed to detect. Grimjaw made his decision. He sat down, folded his primary appendages in a gesture of non-aggression, and looked directly at the observation deck. His species didn't possess vocal cords capable of producing sounds audible to most galactic species, but they developed sophisticated sign language for communicating with their handlers. The message he transmitted was clear and unambiguous. Refuse engagement. Apex predator classification error. Request immediate consultation. The arena fell into stunned silence. Specialist Crickstel, Grimjaw's handler, was the first to react. His Volanti physiology produced visible stress responses as he processed the unprecedented situation. In 8 years of Academy service, Grimjaw had never refused an examination engagement. Moorkeepers were professionally reliable, thoroughly trained, and completely committed to their educational responsibility. The idea that one would simply refuse to participate in a trial was like suggesting that gravity might decide to work backwards on Tuesdays. Admiral Vexthara activated the arena communication system. Specialist Crickstel, please, clarify your predator's status report. Crickstel's response came through with audible stress harmonics. Admiral, Grimjaw is indicating that the Cadet represents an apex predator classification and that engagement would violate standard safety protocols for territorial disputes. The observation deck erupted in confused discussion. Dr. Korthovel was frantically accessing xenobiology databases, while Captain Zaraneth attempted to understand how their carefully planned examination had suddenly transformed into an interspecies diplomatic incident. Down in the arena, Marcus had approached to within conversational distance of Grimjaw's position. The human moved with the sort of casual confidence that came from complete situational awareness, stopping at precisely the range that demonstrated respect for Grimjaw's capabilities without showing submission or fear. "You figured it out, didn't you?" Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the arena's acoustics. Grimjaw's response was a complex series of gestures that Specialist Crickstel translated with increasing bewilderment. "The predator indicates recognition of shared classification. He's asking about the human's hunting territory and preferred prey species." Admiral Vexthara's primary processing matrix was working at maximum capacity, trying to integrate this information with everything they thought they knew about human psychology and physiology. "Request clarification from the human cadet." Marcus looked up at the observation deck with something that might have been amusement. "Admiral, with respect, your xenobiology files are missing some significant information about human evolutionary history." Dr. Korthov activated his communication interface. "Cadet Chen, please elaborate. Our analysis indicates that humans are omnivorous tool users with no specialized predatory adaptations." "That's not exactly accurate, Doctor. We're omnivorous tool users who spent roughly 2 million years as persistence hunters on a world where everything bigger than us had more teeth, claws, speed, or armor than we did." Marcus gestured toward Grimjaw, who was following the conversation with obvious interest. "We didn't develop natural weapons because we didn't need them. We developed something else instead." "Which was?" Captain Zaraneth inquired. Marcus smiled, and for the first time since arriving at the academy, the expression was completely genuine. "We learned how to be the thing that other predators have nightmares about. We learned how to track prey across continents, how to coordinate pack hunts across multiple terrain types, and how to keep pursuing targets until they literally died of exhaustion. We learned how to be patient, methodical, and absolutely relentless." He paused, looking around the arena. "Most importantly, we learned how to study our prey's behavior patterns, anticipate their responses, and adapt our tactics in real time. Your examination protocols are designed to test how cadets respond to encountering apex predators. The thing is, Admiral, humans don't respond to encountering apex predators. We study them, categorize them, and figure out the most efficient way to kill them." The observation deck fell silent. Grimjaw produced another series of gestures, which Specialist Crickstel translated with obvious reluctance. "The predator indicates that the human's behavioral assessment is accurate. He states that engaging with the human would require territorial combat protocols rather than examination procedures." Dr. Kurthovel was reviewing his files with increasing agitation. "But our psychological profiles indicated anxiety disorders, social attachment behaviors, and non-aggressive response patterns." Marcus laughed, and the sound carried an edge that made several faculty members instinctively step backward. "Doctor, what you classified as anxiety disorders are actually threat assessment systems. What you called social attachment behaviors are pack coordination instincts. And those non-aggressive response patterns? That's called tactical patience. We don't attack until we're sure we can win." Admiral Vexthara processed this information through multiple analytical frameworks before reaching the obvious conclusion. "The examination is terminated. Medical teams stand down. Security teams stand down." She paused, accessing diplomatic protocols. "Cadet Chen, please report to debriefing for comprehensive species reclassification procedures." Marcus nodded acknowledgement and approached Grimjaw's position one final time. The two apex predators regarded each other with mutual respect before Marcus offered what appeared to be a formal gesture of non-aggression. Grimjaw responded with his own species equivalent, and the two separated with the sort of professional courtesy typically reserved for experienced warriors, acknowledging each other's competence. The debriefing session lasted for 6 hours and involved representatives from the Academy administration, the Xenobiology Department, the Diplomatic Corps, and the Insurance and Liability Assessment Office. Marcus answered questions about human hunting behaviors, evolutionary history, and military psychology with the sort of patient thoroughness that suggested he'd been expecting this conversation for months. The resulting reports required significant revisions to Academy protocols, diplomatic classifications, and insurance risk assessments. Humans were reclassified from harmless omnivores with anxiety disorders to apex predators with advanced tactical intelligence, which had substantial implications for future exchange programs. More immediately, it explained several previously confusing aspects of human behavior that Academy staff had observed over the years. Their tendency to form strong social bonds wasn't pack attachment, it was tactical unit cohesion. Their concerns about personal safety weren't neurotic anxiety, they were threat assessment protocols. Their persistent questions about Academy procedures weren't social curiosity, they were intelligence-gathering operations. Admiral Vex Thara compiled her final report 3 days later, noting with crystalline precision that the Academy's examination protocols would require substantial revision to accommodate predatory species that didn't conform to standard aggressive response patterns. She also recommended that future human exchange cadets received specialized orientation programs designed to acknowledge their actual capabilities rather than their diplomatic classifications. Dr. Corthavel spent the following weeks completely rewriting the xenobiology curriculum, incorporating lessons about the dangers of surface-level species analysis and the importance of understanding evolutionary context when assessing alien psychology. His revised textbooks included an entire chapter dedicated to what he termed cryptic apex predators, species whose predatory nature was concealed by their social behaviors or diplomatic presentations. Captain Zaraneth redesigned the combat training programs to account for students whose tactical thinking operated on entirely different timescales than traditional military doctrine. The human approach to warfare, methodical, patient, and utterly comprehensive, required new teaching methods and assessment criteria. Marcus Chen graduated with full honors and was immediately recruited by the Hegemony's Strategic Planning Division, where his species' particular talents for long-term tactical analysis proved invaluable. His success led to an expansion of the human exchange program and the establishment of specialized tracks for students from other diplomatically misclassified species. Grimjaw returned to examination duties with a new appreciation for the complexity of interspecies relations. His encounter with Marcus had been educational in ways that 8 years of Academy service hadn't prepared him for, and he approached future examinations with considerably more attention to subtle behavioral indicators that might suggest hidden predatory capabilities. The incident became part of Academy folklore, told and retold by successive generations of cadets, as both cautionary tale and source of entertainment. The story evolved over time, as such stories do, but the essential lesson remained constant. Never assume you understand a species based on their diplomatic classification, their physical appearance, or their social behaviors. The galaxy was full of apex predators, and some of them were very, very good at pretending to be something else. In his final report, Marcus noted with characteristic human understatement that the examination had been educational for all parties involved. He recommended that future protocols include more comprehensive species research, better interpredatory communication systems, and perhaps a review of insurance policies to account for the diplomatic complications that arose when apex predators recognized each other in educational settings. He also suggested, with the sort of dry humor that had characterized his entire Academy experience, that the next human exchange cadet might benefit from clearer expectations about examination procedures. After all, it was only fair to warn Academy staff when they were planning to test an apex predator. The resulting policy changes proved to be some of the most significant reforms in Academy history, though they were implemented with the sort of bureaucratic efficiency that made them seem routine rather than revolutionary. Future generations of cadets would benefit from more accurate species classifications, more appropriate examination protocols, and considerably better inter-predator safety procedures. But perhaps most importantly, they would benefit from the hard-learned lesson that the galaxy's most dangerous predators weren't always the ones with the biggest teeth, the sharpest claws, or the most obviously lethal capabilities. Sometimes, they were the ones who smiled politely, asked thoughtful questions, and waited patiently for exactly the right moment to demonstrate just how thoroughly they'd been underestimated. The Academy's motto, carved in crystalline script above the main entrance, read, "Strength through knowledge, victory through understanding." After the Marcus Chen incident, several faculty members suggested adding a subtitle, "And always check your species classifications twice." The suggestion was ultimately rejected as unnecessarily specific, but the sentiment became an unofficial part of Academy culture, passed down through generations of instructors who had learned the hard way that the universe's most important lessons often came disguised as routine educational exercises. After all, the best predators were the ones you never saw coming until it was far too late to do anything but acknowledge their superior tactical position